Soviet Russia was a burning thing. The Civil War, it was a fiery ring. Yeah, okay, cool, we're gonna end that one. The Civil War was a fundamentally challenging, oh God, what do you even want to call it? A conflict, a whole range of issues arose from that. It had a massive impact economically, socially. It fundamentally changed the nature of the Soviet regime and was a very real military threat to the Sovnarkom, the Soviet government. And Boris Ponomarev, rightly described it as like a ring of fire. How did they manage to win? Because by 1920, win they did. There's a number of factors. Let's go through them. First of all, geography. The Bolsheviks controlled Central European Russia, and that meant that they have a far larger population on which to draw. 70 million people as opposed to 8 to 10 million or so. And that was a massive advantage for recruiting troops as a workforce, contributing to the economy. The other aspect in controlling European Russia was that they had greater access to a far larger railway network, and the Russian Civil War was a war of movement, and therefore transferring troops from front to front was a really critical advantage that the Reds were able to do. Holding European Russia also meant that their population was more ethnically homogenous, which made it easier to govern, and they also, too, in controlling major cities, had access to ammunition supplies left by the former Tsarist government, and also the support of industry. Okay, next factor. Ideology. The Red Army shared a united ideological vision. They knew what they were fighting for communist ideology against capitalist imperialism. Whereas the Whites weren't able to draw accurately a vision of what they all stood for, other than that they hated the Bolsheviks, whereas the Bolsheviks, had language around class struggle, hatred of the bourgeoisie, imperialism, that they were able to articulate it very well through propaganda. So visual propaganda was used enormously during the Russian Civil War. The government had even special, what they called agitprop trains, so trains that were painted with revolutionary artworks that toured from place to place explaining what the Bolshevik regime was all about. So they were able to more effectively mobilize the population. Next factor. Trotsky's leadership. Trotsky was critical in the Russian Civil War. Not only did he just have a competition and have this wonderful hat design, but he shifted the Red Army that was, in the beginning, more or less a ragtag group, former Red Guards, into, by the end of 1918, it had more than 500,000 men, so it's 500,000 soldiers, to a force of 5 million fighting men, a well-armed professional fighting force by the end of the Civil War. How did he do it? Harsh disciplinary measures were a fundamental thing that Trotsky brought in to really harden up the Red Army. There were quite harsh punishments for a whole range of things, disobedience, desertion. The Cheka was used to be positioned behind Red Army soldiers as sometimes when they were advancing, so they had the possibility of death ahead, the guarantee of death behind. Trotsky employed what was called military experts, the spetsy. They were former Tsarist officers, military experts, who then were able to effectively lead the Red Army. Their loyalty was guaranteed, though, by the use of what was called commissars. So loyal officials, those the commissars, were appointed to countersign any order given by the officers, the spetsy, and also that the commissars would play a role in indoctrinating the troops. Trotsky importantly said that if anything went wrong, he'd go first to the commissar and then to the officer. So the commissars did a pretty good job of trying to keep things pretty tight organisationally and in terms of their discipline. Trotsky, though, too, it wasn't all just by threat. The Red Army, its officer corps were quite young because, unlike, say, the Tsarist military, you were promoted up because of talent, and so many young non-commissioned officers were a feature in the Red Army. And you would be rewarded and recognized for your efforts. And that also applied, though, to the military experts as well. Trotsky's personal leadership was critical. He had a mobile headquarters in a train, okay, toot toot, and he would race from front to front. And on a number of occasions, his personal intervention was critical. You will recall we talked about Yudenich's campaign against Petrograd, and the Soviet government had considered abandoning Petrograd, but Trotsky raced there, jumped off the train, and no boys, let's fight for Petrograd, and that was successful. His train had a whole range of experts, so engineers, sharpshooters, machine gunnists, propagandists. He even had who were all able to offer particular expertise wherever it might be needed. They all had funky leather jackets. He even had his own newspaper on the road to give news about what he was doing. Little tangent here. Trotsky had also someone who would follow him around, taking photos and recording speeches for him for posterity, for history. Bit of an ego on him, old Leon. But nevertheless, his leadership was absolutely critical. He was an incredibly inspiring leader. He could a really powerful speaker, a brilliant organizer. His ruthless, determined leadership really fundamentally was a huge factor in the success of the Reds. As one contemporary described him, he was a son of a bitch, but the greatest Jew since Jesus. Some people couldn't stand him, Stalin for one, but others thought he was absolutely brilliant. Okay, next factor. White Army weaknesses. As the Civil War dragged on, the White Army generals found it increasingly hard to maintain discipline amongst their troops. The white forces were notoriously corrupt, and desertion really plagued them. But I suppose one of the factors that really, influenced that was that difficulty of articulating what they were fighting for. As Denikin complained, "I can do nothing with my army. I'm glad when it carries out my combat orders." He later said, "If I raise the Republican flag, I lose half my volunteers. If I raise the monarchist flag, I lose the other half. But we have to save Russia." So that disparity of what they were fighting for undermined the white movement. In the end, so this is your key slogan about the whites, the best that they could offer, as opposed to the whole gamut array of what the Red Army were articulating, what the Bolsheviks were articulating with their slogans and their propaganda trains, all that action. The best that they could come up with was Russia shall be great, united, and undivided. In terms of its popularity pool for your average peasants, not so good. Didn't help either, too, that the whites, on a number of occasions, reinstated landlords and did some other nasty stuff as well, like pogroms against Jewish communities too. They weren't able to. They neglected effective government administration in the era. So in the end, the whites could offer no better alternative to the Reds, and the Red Army had a number of factors to its advantage: Trotsky's leadership, geographical elements, and the fact that they managed to get themselves so clearly as the better alternative in terms of for workers and soldiers and peasants once you consider what they were offering ideologically. That is, that they'll continue to be associated with Soviet power. And that's the end of that. Das Vidania!